History Secrets.
The story of the Gospel of Mary begins wrapped in silence, fragments, and absence. Unlike canonical texts, it has not reached us in complete form. Important parts simply disappeared over time. And perhaps it is precisely in that void where its greatest mystery lies. What did this text really say? And why was it forgotten? To understand this narrative, we must return to the early centuries of Christianity, a period marked by diversity of ideas, theological disputes, and different interpretations of the message of Jesus. Not all groups thought the same way. Not all accepted the same authorities. And not all recognized the same texts as sacred. In that context, a figure already known in the canonical Gospels emerges: Mary Magdalene. But here, she appears in a different way, not only as a follower, but as someone who understands profound teachings that other disciples seem not to fully grasp. This raises an inevitable question. Could this text be preserving an alternative tradition about the teachings of Jesus, or reflecting a later interpretation constructed by specific communities? To answer, we must observe the fragments of the text itself. The most well-known manuscript was found in Coptic, probably dated between the 3rd and 4th centuries. But it is believed that the original content is even older, possibly from the 2nd century. The text begins after the death of Jesus. The disciples are gathered, confused, afraid, and without clear direction. At that moment, Mary Magdalene stands up. She begins to speak, and what she shares is not a common memory. It is a teaching, something that, according to the text, she would have received directly from Jesus. This completely changes the dynamic of the narrative, because it is not Peter, nor John, nor any other traditional apostle who assumes the central role. It is Mary, and this generates tension, something that was not easily accepted. According to the account, some disciples question her authority, especially Peter. He directly asks whether Jesus would truly have revealed such teachings to her, and not to the others. This reaction does not seem accidental. It reflects a possible internal conflict within early Christian communities, who had authority to teach, who truly understood the message of Jesus, and more importantly, was revelation public or reserved for a few. The text suggests that Mary possesses a specific type of knowledge, not based only on external words, but on an inner experience, a direct understanding. This leads us to a deeper layer, the theological one. In the Gospel of Mary, the focus is not on church structure, nor on external rituals, but on inner transformation, on the liberation of the soul, and on overcoming the illusions of the material world. Some traditions associate this type of thought with what we now call Gnostic currents. But it is important to be cautious. Not every ancient text with symbolic language can be simply classified. What we see here is a clear emphasis on consciousness, on perception, and on liberation through inner knowledge. But what exactly does Mary describe? According to the preserved fragments, she describes a vision, a spiritual experience. In it, the soul passes through different levels or powers, each one trying to prevent its progress. These powers represent forces that imprison consciousness: fear, desire, ignorance. The soul must recognize these forces and overcome them. Only then can it reach freedom. This type of language is highly symbolic. and opens space for multiple interpretations. Would these powers be real spiritual entities, or representations of internal psychological states? Perhaps you are wondering, is this teaching compatible with the canonical Gospels? Or are we dealing with a completely different tradition? The answer is not simple. There are points of convergence. The idea of inner transformation, for example, also appears in canonical texts. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, verse 21, we find the statement that the kingdom of God is within you. But in the Gospel of Mary, this idea seems to be taken even further. The emphasis is not only on the presence of the kingdom, but on the journey of the soul to completely free itself from the structures that limit it. This suggests a more introspective spirituality, less institutional, and possibly more difficult to control within an organized structure. And perhaps this leads us to one of the most important questions. Why was this text not included in the canon? The formation of the biblical canon was a long process, and it involved specific criteria, apostolicity, liturgical use, theological coherence, but also, inevitably, human decisions. Some texts were preserved, others were set aside, and others simply disappeared. The Gospel of Mary may have been one of those cases. A text known by some communities, but not widely accepted, or perhaps considered problematic, especially for presenting a female figure in a position of spiritual authority. And this cannot be ignored. In the text, Mary does not only speak, she teaches, interprets, guides the other disciples. This suggests that, at some point, there were traditions where the role of women was different from what later became established. But to what extent does this reflect a historical reality or symbolic construction? This remains a debated question. What we do know is that Mary Magdalene already appears in the canonical Gospels as a central witness. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 18, she is the first to announce the resurrection. This already places her in a unique position. But the Gospel of Mary expands that role. It transforms her into a bearer of hidden teachings. And this changes everything, because it alters the way we understand the transmission of Jesus' message, no longer as something uniform, but as something plural, diverse, and perhaps more complex than we imagine. If we continue exploring the text, we perceive that the teaching attributed to Mary is not only descriptive, it is deeply structured. There is an eternal logic in the way the journey of the soul is presented, and this structure reveals something important. It is not just an isolated vision, but a system of spiritual understanding. According to the fragments, the soul ascends facing forces that question it. These forces challenge its legitimacy, its origin, its nature, as if they were testing its consciousness. And at each stage, the soul's response is not based on beliefs, but on recognition. It affirms that it does not belong to those forces, that its essence is different, and that it can no longer be held by them. This detail is fundamental, because it suggests a spirituality based on inner identity, not on external obedience. Something there did not fit within traditional structures. If we compare this with canonical texts, we perceive a subtle but significant difference. In the traditional Gospels, the emphasis often falls on faith, repentance, and relationship with God. Here, the emphasis seems to shift toward knowledge and direct perception. This does not imply opposition, but it indicates a different approach, and that approach may have been considered controversial, especially at a time when Christianity was beginning to organize itself institutionally. But there is another element that deserves attention: the reaction of the disciples. After Mary finishes her exposition, the text describes a climate of tension. Some accept her words, others show resistance. Peter, again, questions, expresses doubt, and even a certain discomfort. This reveals a possible conflict of authority, but also something deeper: a divergence regarding the very nature of revelation. Is it something that can be received individually, or must it always pass through a recognized authority? Perhaps you are noticing that this question remains relevant even today, and perhaps that is precisely why this text continues to attract interest, because it touches on a sensitive point: the relationship between personal experience and established tradition. But there is a detail that often goes unnoticed. The Gospel of Mary does not present Jesus as a distant figure, nor as someone inaccessible. On the contrary, he appears as someone who leads to self-knowledge, who directs inward, who guides perception toward inner reality. This can be seen as a continuation of certain elements present in other texts. But here, this dimension is central, not peripheral, and this can have important implications. If the focus is on inner transformation, then external authority loses part of its function, and that, historically, tends to generate resistance. Some ancient traditions suggest that different Christian communities preserve different emphases, some more oriented toward organization and doctrine, others more focused on direct experience and inner knowledge. The Gospel of Mary could be situated within this second group, but it is important to avoid simplistic conclusions. The text is fragmented. We do not have access to its entirety. Important parts have been lost, and this limits any definitive interpretation. Even so, the existing fragments allow some consistent observations. The first is the centrality of Mary as a figure of understanding. She is not only a messenger, but someone who interprets the teaching. The second is the emphasis on the liberation of the soul, not as a future event, but as a present process. The third is the symbolic language used to describe this process, which indicates a tradition that values interpretation and reflection. But perhaps the most intriguing point is another: the silence. What is not in the text? What has been lost? And what might completely change the way we interpret it? What was in the missing pages? What kind of teaching was erased by time or by human decisions? This absence is not just a historical gap. It is part of the mystery itself. Something there remains hidden, and perhaps we may never fully recover it. But that does not prevent investigation. On the contrary, it makes it even more necessary. If we go even further in the analysis, we perceive that the Gospel of Mary does not attempt to establish a closed doctrine. It does not present a rigid system of rules, nor a defined institutional structure. What we find is something more subtle: a direction, a movement of consciousness. This may indicate that the text was preserved in an environment where individual experience had great value, where teaching was not only transmitted, but lived. And this leads us to a critical question. What was the role of Mary Magdalene within those communities? Was she seen as a spiritual leader, or as a symbol of deeper understanding? Perhaps both. In the canonical Gospels, she already appears as a figure close to Jesus, present at crucial moments, especially in the crucifixion and resurrection. But in those texts, her role is more narrative. In the Gospel of Mary, it becomes interpretative, and that completely transforms her function. She does not only testify, she understands, she explains, and this creates a new layer of meaning. If we observe later tradition, we perceive that this image was not widely maintained. Over the centuries, Mary Magdalene was associated with other narratives, sometimes in a confused way, other times with interpretations that have no direct textual basis. This may indicate a process of transformation of her image over time, but it also raises another possibility. Were there multiple traditions about Mary Magdalene from the beginning? Traditions that emphasize different aspects of her figure? If so, then the Gospel of Mary could be a window into one of those currents, a less known current, but not necessarily less relevant. And this leads us to a delicate point: the construction of history, the way certain narratives are preserved, and others are set aside. History is not only what happened, it is also what was transmitted and what was forgotten. Some scholars suggest that texts like the Gospel of Mary reflect an early phase of Christianity in which there was still no uniformity, in which different groups tried to understand the teachings of Jesus based on their own experiences. In that scenario, divergences were natural and perhaps inevitable. But over time, a process of consolidation took place. Some interpretations gained predominance, others were marginalized, and some disappeared almost completely. The Gospel of Mary seems to belong to this group, a text that survived partially, but still preserves echoes of a broader tradition. And perhaps that is precisely what makes it so relevant today, not as a substitute for canonical texts, but as a historical complement, as a testimony of diversity, as evidence that the beginnings of Christianity were more complex than we often imagine. If we gather all these elements, one final reflection begins to take shape. What do we do with these texts today? Should they be read as historical sources? As theological documents? As symbolic expressions of a spiritual search? Perhaps the answer is not singular, and perhaps it should not be. The Gospel of Mary does not impose a conclusion. It does not force an interpretation. It remains open, and in that space, it invites reflection. Beyond its origin, beyond its fragmentation, beyond the disputes over its authenticity, there is something that remains, a question. Is it possible to understand the spiritual through direct experience? Or must all understanding necessarily pass through an established structure? Perhaps the value of this text lies not only in what it affirms, but in what it provokes. Because it does not close, It does not define, it does not conclude. And perhaps that is precisely why it continues to be read, studied, and rediscovered. History never reveals all its secrets. Between ruins, forgotten manuscripts, and lost civilizations, there are still questions that challenge everything we think we know. Perhaps some answers have already been found, but many others remain hidden. Subscribe to the channel and continue exploring the deepest mysteries of history. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.